Chapter 1. Jean Winters stood silently as she watched her best friend, Erin Kroll, marry a total stranger. She admired her for not shaking and actually being able to speak her vows without crumpling onto the floor. Erin had called just a few months before, telling her that she was planning on being matched to a stranger. Jean remembered the conversation well. As soon as she'd answered the phone, Erin's excitement had been almost palpable. "Jean, I'm going to do it. I'm getting married." "Really? I didn't even know you were dating someone. Who are you marrying?" For a moment, she'd been hurt that her friend had been dating someone and hadn't even told her about it. "That's the thing. I have no idea. None. A man. That's all I know." Erin had sounded amused by the whole thing. "How can you marry a stranger?" Jean pushed away from her desk and walked to the water cooler. There was no way she could work and concentrate on this conversation. "I was surfing the internet the other day, because I was avoiding grading speeches, and I found this website where you go through all this testing to find the perfect match for you. And get this, they introduce you at the altar." "That sounds scary. Are you really going to do it?" "I already went through all my testing, and it's happening. Just waiting to be told when to show up at the church and marry him." Jean paused for a moment, thinking about how nice it would be to just be matched to someone and not have to go through all the rituals of dating. She was shy and had trouble with the entire dating process. But Erin was outgoing and fun. She'd never had problems getting a date. "Have you lost your ever-loving mind?" "That sounds like something I should do, but not you." "Why?" Erin had sighed. "I can't just start dating someone after Randall. When he died, he took a hunk of my heart with him. I can't imagine ever loving someone else, but I want children." Jean leaned against a window, looking out over the skyline of downtown Atlanta. This was the prettiest time of day in Georgia. Sunset always made her happy. "What's the name of the company? Are you going to give them a call?" "I think you should. Dr. Lachele comes highly recommended. My sister knows several couples she matched. I might call them. But only if you decide to give me the name of the company." Erin laughed. "I'm so excited I keep forgetting to answer your question." "And you still haven't." Jean and Erin had been roommates all through college and adored each other. Erin wasn't usually quite this flighty. "Matchrimony. Don't you just love that name? It has a great ring to it." "It does." Jean glanced at the clock on the wall. As a stockbroker, her whole life was based on the clock. After hours, trading had just finished, and she had several phone calls to make yet. 12-hour days were the norm, not the exception for her. And tax season, her busiest time of year, wasn't for a few months. "I have to get back to work." Erin sighed. "You need to stop working so many hours. I want you to take a 6-month sabbatical." Jean laughed softly. "Like that will ever happen. But you'll fly up for my wedding, right?" "I wouldn't miss it for the world." After ending the call, she'd wandered back to her desk and sighed. Looking up Matchrimony would have to wait. She hadn't heard of them, so they must not be a publicly traded company. Jean shook her head slightly, realizing only then that she was ignoring her friend's wedding. She watched as Erin and her new husband, whose name Jean hadn't caught, kissed for the first time. When Erin turned, she had a huge grin on her face. The newlyweds took off for the back of the church, and Jean smiled at Megan, Erin's sister, who was standing up with her as well. "Looks like Erin is pleased." Megan nodded. "It does. I wonder what has her so excited." Jean shrugged. "No clue. He's handsome." "He is." Megan sighed and rubbed her belly. "Maybe we'll have babies close together. Wouldn't that be great? I hope it works out that way. Maybe I can have one soon after." Dr. Lachele and I are driving to Culpeper to see you tomorrow. We've heard so much about Bob's Burger Barn that we have to drive out and eat there at least once. Is she going to do your evaluation in the car? She said she could. We'll be working on it during lunch as well, I'm sure, but we'll at least get started on the way there. What time are you coming? I can have lunch with you. Megan and Jean had been friends for almost as long as Aaron and Jean had. The Kroll family had accepted her as one of their own. Jean had been raised in foster care, bouncing from one home to another. She had no family of her own, so it was good to be accepted for a change. I'd love that. I think we'll be there around noon. Does that work for you? Sounds great. I'll warn Bob to have some fried cheese curds ready. Fried, what? Trust me. You haven't lived until you've eaten one of Bob's taco burgers with some fried cheese curds. Jean smiled. Sounds like you're happy you married your burger maker. I couldn't be happier. Megan started toward the back of the church and the fellowship hall, where a small reception would take place. Mom and Dad are freaking out about Erin's choice, but I keep reminding them that it's exactly that, Erin's choice. She's a big girl now, and she gets to make her own decisions. She should feel blessed to have someone care about her so much. Jean had lived in Atlanta since graduation, so 5 years, and she had only made a few friends, who were really just work acquaintances. She was alone when she wasn't working, and while it suited her at times, it didn't always. She flew back to Wyoming on every vacation she had, because she wanted to spend time with people she cared about. Megan hurried off, mumbling something about the baby tap dancing on her bladder, so Jean went on to the fellowship hall alone. Even without Aaron or Megan, she knew the Krolls, and they wouldn't let her stand around alone looking lost, which was her specialty at big events. She'd also met Dr. Lachele from Matchrimony, though she wasn't sure how much good that would do her. Dr. Lachele was, well, odd was the word that sprang to her mind. The older woman was short with purple hair and the most beautiful green eyes Jean had ever seen. She was full of life, laughing at her own jokes, and demanding booby bumps from everyone who saw her. She was definitely an odd bird. She stood alone at the edge of the room for a moment, scanning the crowd for someone she knew. Surely Aaron had invited other college friends, and she would know them. Aaron had very kindly included her awkward roommate in absolutely everything she did during her college years, determined that Jean wouldn't sit in their room alone studying all the time. "Trying to avoid me?" asked a voice close to her ear. Jean jumped, startled, as she turned to confront the person. Dr. Lachele. She should have known. Of course not. Dr. Lachele threw back her head and cackled. Her laugh couldn't really be described any other way. You don't think I can see the panic in your eyes when you think about spending all day tomorrow alone with me? I promise, I'll make it as painless as I possibly can. I won't make you talk to strangers or even break dance on the highway. Jean blinked at the purple-haired woman. I never thought you would. Dr. Lachele laughed again. What do you do for a living, Jean? Maybe we can ask a few getting-to-know-you questions as we wait for this party to get started. I'm a stockbroker. Sounds hideously boring. Do you like it? Jean thought about that for a moment. Did she like her job? It was the only thing she'd done since receiving her degree in finance, and she was very good at it, but did she like it? No, I don't think I do. But it pays well, and I'm good at it. What would you rather do? Dr. Lachele asked. Jean hadn't expected the question, and she furrowed her brow as she thought about it. I really don't know. It might be nice to own a little bookstore and do nothing but read and help customers find books all day. She shook her head with a laugh. It would never work for me, though. I'm terrible at that sort of thing. How do you know? Have you ever done it? Jean frowned. Well, I'm pretty much afraid of people. How could I possibly own a store and make it profitable if I'm afraid of people? And you don't have to talk to people in the work you do now? Jean shrugged. That's different. I get paid to talk to them now. It's my job. And it would be then too. Dr. Lachele sighed. I hate looking at a young woman, knowing she goes to a job she detests every day. It doesn't seem right. I never really thought about whether I liked it or not. I just knew it's what I had to do to pay the bills, so I did it. Isn't that the American way? You do whatever it takes to pay the bills, and crush all your dreams under your heel? Dr. Lachele shook her head. I do exactly what I love. I don't care if other people don't like me. I live life as I please. I wish you'd do the same. Jean gave her a sad sort of smile. I don't see that happening any time in the near future. Maybe someday. I'm going to keep encouraging your dreams, Jean. You deserve to have them just as much as everyone else does. I'll take your word for it. They were interrupted as the newlyweds came into the room, and Jean looked at Erin closely. Her friend had obviously been very thoroughly kissed since the last time she saw her. Maybe Dr. Lachele knew what she was doing after all. Jean expected no more from life than simply existing, and that's all she'd ever done. Dreams were for children. They were always crushed. No, she wasn't going to even think about who her new husband would be after Dr. Lachele matched her up. What was the point? She was bound to be disappointed. Asterisk. Dillon Jeffries stared at his Uncle Larry's lawyer, shocked to the core. Are you kidding me? Dillon's great-uncle had raised him after his parents died when he was an infant. The man had never married, always seeming content to run his business and make money. Loads and loads of money. I'm afraid not, John DeMamio told him. He was very specific in what he wanted. He said that he doesn't want you to get into the kind of rut he was in, and you need to live your life. So he's forcing me to marry? That seemed to be his answer. He wanted you to have children to leave your business to. He claimed you're the grandson he never had, but he wished he'd made better choices in his youth. So he decided to force you to make the choices he thought were better. Dillon folded his arms on the table in front of him, leaning forward. What's to stop me from marrying the first random stranger I meet and just staying married for long enough to fulfill the terms of his stupid will? The lawyer sighed. He told me you'd ask that. I'm supposed to make periodic checks on your marriage. Every month for the first year. After that, every 3 months. If you divorce within 5 years of marriage, you forfeit the entire sum of money. You keep the house regardless. Like I could afford the upkeep on the house if I didn't have the money. He pushed away from the conference table and paced back and forth. And I have how long to marry? The old man must have lost his mind before writing that will. While there had never been a lot of warmth between them, he'd loved his great-uncle, and he'd believed the man loved him as much as he was capable of loving. 3 months from the date the will is read. Dillon groaned, flopping back down in his chair. I'm not even seeing anyone right now. How am I supposed to find a girl to marry me in 3 months? Are you sure there are no loopholes? Nothing I can do to get out of it? You can forego the money. Dillon sighed. Billions. He could forego billions of dollars to assert his independence, or he could go find some woman desperate enough to marry a man she barely knew. I guess I'm getting married. I'm sorry. I told your uncle you wouldn't be pleased with this. What happens to the money if I don't marry? If you don't marry, the entire amount goes to homeless shelters across the nation. As it stands, 1/4 of the money goes to shelters. So do you need to be invited to the wedding, or can I just show you the marriage certificate? Mr. DeMamio smiled. I'm afraid I need to be there every step of the way. Dillon got back to his feet. He wanted the money. He wasn't greedy, and he didn't have a lavish lifestyle, but he'd started his own business. It was glorified house flipping. He bought up old mansions and restored them to their former glory, and then sold them. With more money, he could hire a crew for some of the work, and he could be the one overseeing it. He had a vision for what he wanted to happen, and the money was needed to make that vision a reality. I'll be in touch. Thank you for your time. Dillon left the room, determined to take a walk. That was his answer to anything that upset him. He walked. He found the nearest park and sat on a park bench, ignoring the cold wind blowing at him. He may live in Atlanta, Georgia, but even Atlanta's winters were cold. Late January had never looked so bleak. He'd lost the only father he'd ever known, and now he was being asked to comply with the ridiculous terms of this will. He needed to find someone who would just set him up with a woman to marry. He didn't want to have to mess with any singles websites. The idea of hooking up with a random stranger was appalling, but so was the idea of having to weed through women. How was he going to convince someone to marry him in 3 months? The obvious answer was to tell her that he'd be rich if she married him, but how would he ever know if she married him for him, or for his money? No, there had to be a better way. And he would find it. Chapter 2. Dillon was replacing the tile in one of the bathrooms of his newest project when his cell phone rang. He sat back on his knees and dug the phone out of the pocket of his jeans. He didn't bother to look at who was calling. Hello? Dillon, this is Dr. Lachele. I've found someone for you. Dillon felt his throat tighten. He'd contacted Dr. Lachele because she'd offered the kind of service he needed. Someone who would find him a wife and introduce them at the altar. He knew it seemed like a desperate thing to do, but he felt desperate. You did? Yep. She's planning a small service for the first Saturday in April. Are you free? Dillon laughed. If I wasn't, I'd make myself free for my wedding. All right. Wedding is at 2 in the afternoon. She gave him the name and location of a church. Can you call me right back and leave me a voicemail with that information? Or better yet, text me? I don't want to forget where I need to be. He knew there was no way he'd remember without writing it down, and he didn't have a pen or pencil handy. After she'd hung up, he looked at the date on his phone. It was already the middle of March. He was going to be married in just a couple of weeks. He knew that should evoke some kind of emotion, but it didn't. He was marrying because he had to. His uncle forced his hand. He shook his head and got back to work. He'd think about marriage later. Asterisk. Jean gratefully took the chocolate that Aaron held out for her. You brought all the flavors I asked for? She asked as she stuck her hand into one of the boxes. Of course I did. I'll send you all the flavors you wanted, and he put a couple of samples in as well. He said you deserved extra for putting up with pregnant Aaron, but I think pregnant Aaron is a lovely person. Jean sighed, looking between Aaron and Megan. I'm surrounded by pregnant women. Who's going to help me with my mental breakdown? Aaron pointed at Megan, who was pointing right back at her. You know we both will, Jean. Are we still going to the spa? Megan asked. I'm willing, but we need them to be certified in prenatal massage if we're going to do that. Otherwise, it's just facials and mani pedis for us. Jean's eyes grew wide. I didn't even think to ask about prenatal massages. I've never had a massage at all. Aaron grinned. I'm just glad you actually took a day off work. Please tell me you got a couple of days off after the wedding. Jean shook her head. Didn't work out. I have the weekend. She remembered that how much Elle worked had caused some headaches for Aaron early on, but now they seemed to get along very well. At least Elle took off work long enough to take me to Switzerland for our honeymoon. It was a business trip, Megan reminded her sister. You complained about it for weeks. She shook her head. Jean, call the spa and see if the massages we're booked for can be prenatals. We can't exactly hide our pregnancies. Aaron stuck her tongue out at her sister. I can. I look like I have a big food baby. There are times I wonder if we're really related, Erin. Jean ignored the two bickering sisters and grabbed her phone, walking into her kitchen to call the spa. When she finished, she went back to her friends. They do prenatal massage. The therapist who had me is the only one who does it, so they're going to put me with a different therapist, and one of you will massage while the other does a facial and vice versa. All set. Megan shrugged. Easier than I thought it would be. Me too. Anyway, since I don't have a spare room, I booked us all at a hotel near here. Jean had sent a car service to take the sisters from the airport to her apartment. I just got home. I'm sorry I didn't have time to pick you up. Well, you are planning a wedding and all. Not much to plan. I have a dress. I have a church and a preacher. I'm not planning a reception or anything, because I really don't know anyone. It'll be us, and whoever he brings with him. Erin frowned. You don't have any friends at work? Jean wrinkled her nose. They're all a bunch of stockbrokers. Total fuddy-duddies. Who would want to be friends with them? You're a fuddy-duddy stockbroker, and we like you. Is it my fault you have bad taste? Jean asked. Erin sighed. You need to find time to do some volunteer work or something. If you're not going to hang out with stockbrokers, you need to meet some non-stockbrokery people. You're making up words again. Jean shook her head at Erin. Hey, I'm a chocolate empress. I can make up any words I want. You should be thankful I left my tiara at home. I'm thinking about getting a scepter to whack Al with when he gets on my nerves. Megan made a face at Erin. I thought you said you weren't going to let this chocolate empress thing go to your head. Erin shrugged. It's hard not to. Jean grabbed her suitcase, not planning to return to her apartment until after the wedding. Where's your wedding dress? Erin asked. It's in my car. I picked it up on my way home from work. Jean led the way to the car. Don't lift anything. I'll do any lifting. Erin sighed. Such is the life of a chocolate empress. Asterisk. At the church Saturday morning, Jean paced back and forth in her dress. True to form, she was ready more than an hour early, which was good and bad. She now had to sit around and worry about what her future husband would be like. When the door opened, Dr. Lachele walked into the church, her arms spread wide. Booby bump. Erin hurried over to Dr. Lachele and hugged her tight. Al is perfect for me. You are a matchmaking genius. Dr. Lachele patted her purple hair into place. I know. She moved on to hug Megan and Jean. Now, I want a picture of a belly bump by you two ladies. Bellies together. Erin and Megan hurried to obey. Erin was just barely showing, but Megan was already 6 months along. Dr. Lachele snapped the picture before turning all her attention to Jean. Stop being nervous. He's a good man. I made sure he was right for you the same way I made sure you were right for him. Trust me. Jean nodded, her face pale. I shouldn't have done this. She was glad she hadn't had lunch, because she was certain she would be losing it if she had. Erin hurried over to Jean's side, taking her hand. Yes, you should have. You are too alone. You need people around you. If you're not going to get married today, you're going to move back to Wyoming. I don't know what you'll do there, but you can't keep spending all your time alone. I'm not always alone. I work a lot of hours, and there are always other people there. That's not what I mean. Who do you have meals with? Who do you sit and just talk about your day with? Jean shrugged. I've never had anyone to do those things with except when we lived together. Erin nodded. That's what I'm saying. You need someone to be a part of your life. I don't know if you need a husband or a best friend, but you need someone. She looked at her friend. You're wasting away. You finally put on a little weight in college, because I made you go to meals with me, which meant you ate. How many meals did you forget this week? No idea. I forgot, remember? I'm worried about you, Jean. You're one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, and you hide yourself away from everyone. You have to let people get to know you. Jean sighed, knowing her friend was right. I'm going through with the wedding. Dr. Lachele's eyes met Aaron's. You keep her calm. I'm going to go and check on her groom. He's here? Jean asked, her voice full of panic. Yup. Wedding's in 10 minutes. I'm going to talk to him, and I'll see you when it's all over. Dr. Lachele put her hand on the doorknob, but then she turned and walked over to where Jean was sitting, taking the seat beside her. I promise you this is a good idea. You need to stop worrying. Everything is going to be just fine. I've got you on speed dial, Jean said, smiling slightly. Good. I'll always answer for you. She hurried out of the room, leaving Jean there, panicking quietly. Asterisk. Dillon looked up as the door to the room he'd been escorted to upon arrival opened. The crazy purple-haired matchmaker he'd hired was there. Don't tell me she didn't show. Dr. Lachele laughed. She's here. I've never seen a bride more nervous, and I have been to a lot of weddings where people are meeting at the altar. Why is she so freaked out then? You'll have to talk to her about that. You know I don't give out information before you meet. She's here with her best friend, and her best friend's sister. No family. No other friends. And that's more than I should have told you. He frowned. He'd only told about 10 people about the wedding, and they'd all come, but they wouldn't have many guests at all. Is there going to be a reception? I don't think so. He shrugged. Okay. Are you ready? Sure. As ready as I'll ever be. He wasn't nervous about marrying, because he had no feelings about it. He was doing it to fulfill the terms of the will and for no other reason. Be gentle with her. She's going to need kindness. Dillon nodded. I can handle that. I know you can, but you might not be aware of the need without prompting. She glanced at her phone. It's time. He moved to the front of the church, frowning at all the empty seats. She must really not have many people in her life, which was sad. He hadn't told a lot of people about the wedding, not wanting to take up spots where her guests would sit. Maybe he should have shouted it from the rooftops. His eyes met Mr. DeMamio's, who was sitting in the front row. The man was living up to his end of the bargain. Now Dillon just had to live up to his. Asterisk. Jean felt her heart plummet as she stood hidden at the back of the church, waiting for her cue to walk down the aisle. Dr. Lachele had offered her husband, Sam, to walk her, but it didn't feel right to Jean. She'd go to him honestly, not pretending to have someone in her life she didn't have. She'd never had a father, and she wouldn't pretend to have one now. She closed her eyes and concentrated on her breathing, worried she would have a panic attack as she walked down the aisle. She'd never had one before, but it seemed that this would be the time if it was going to happen. A hand on her arm let her know it was time. Now she wished she had someone walking with her. Anyone. She'd take Dr. Lachele at this moment, because desperation was setting in. One foot in front of the other, Jean. You can do it. With one more deep breath, she started walking slowly down the aisle toward the front of the church, and the man she'd never met. He had dark blonde hair, and he wore a nice suit. His eyes were on her, and there was a slight smile on his lips. Her eyes were drawn to his, and it seemed as if he was reeling her toward him with the power of his mind. He must be some sort of wizard, because she forgot her panic. Everything but him disappeared from her mind. She smiled slightly at the direction her thoughts were going. She was being ridiculous. Dillon felt as if he'd been punched in the gut, so strong was his attraction to the pretty girl walking toward him. She'd been pretty at first, when it had seemed as if every step she took had taken a Herculean effort. When she'd smiled, that's when he'd felt it. She was about to be his. How could a man not respond powerfully to knowing the woman walking toward him was about to promise to stay with him till death? He knew it didn't really happen that way for most people, but for him it would. When she reached his side, he held his hand out for hers, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed hers in it. "Hi," he whispered softly. "Hi," she responded, feeling like she was doing something wrong, whispering at her own wedding. But there was no one there to tell her to mind her manners. Or to say she was uncouth. She was coming into this marriage alone, and would hopefully never have to be alone again. After their vows were spoken, his in a calm, clear voice, hers merely a whisper, the pastor had them face one another. "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Dillon held one of her hands in each of his and pulled her toward him, his lips coming down on hers gently. As his lips brushed hers, he saw the fear in her brown eyes, and he wondered what had put it there. He wondered how he could remove it. Because there was no reception planned, he stayed at the front of the church, both of her hands still in his. "I'm Dillon." "I'm Jean." A smile played at her lips. "Forgive me, but I'd love to know what my new last name is." She had been so distracted during the ceremony, she hadn't caught his name, even though she was certain the pastor had used it. He laughed softly. She had a sense of humor. He could work with that. "It's Jeffries." "You're Jean Jeffries." "It has nice alliteration." "It does." "What do you do for a living, Dillon Jeffries?" She knew people were talking to one another all around them, but she needed to concentrate on her new husband. She had to get to know him at least a little bit before she'd feel comfortable leaving with him. "I'm a house flipper. I buy old houses, restore them, then sell them." He watched her face carefully, waiting to see if there was any censure for not having a corporate job. Not that it would matter if there was. He was very happy with what he did. For a couple of years, when he was first out of college, he'd worked with his uncle, but he hadn't been happy. Now that he had his own business, he woke up with a smile every day, excited to work. He knew few people who had that kind of drive. "What do you do?" "I'm a stockbroker." As she said the words, she realized they sounded good. Professional. But she hated the idea of going back to work at the job she despised. She would though. Because that's what she did. She kept going no matter how badly her world was crashing down around her. "Sounds boring." Jean laughed. "It is. More boring than you can imagine. Pay is good, so I'll keep doing it." "What would you do if you could do anything you wanted in the whole world?" A smile played at her lips. "I was asked that recently. I think I would own a little bookshop where I got to tell people what books were good every day. My own little piece of heaven." "You should do that then. As soon as I win the lottery." Jean didn't know why his face fell, but she hoped she hadn't said anything offensive. "Is that wrong?" Dillon shook his head. "Not at all. I hope you do win someday." Chapter 3. Jean turned, her hand still in his. "You need to meet my two closest friends. They flew down from Wyoming for the wedding. This is Erin Frank, who was my college roommate." Dillon smiled at the short, dark-haired woman in front of him. "It's nice to meet you." "You too. Dr. Lachele matched my husband and me back in December. We couldn't be happier. Nice to hear a success story. It's hard to believe, as I'm standing here next to a stranger, that happily ever after is on the horizon." Jean felt her heart drop at Dillon's words. Did that mean he wasn't attracted to her? Did he want to trade her in for someone else already? "Sorry," she mumbled softly. "Why are you sorry?" Dillon asked, confused. "I'm obviously not what you were hoping for." Dillon thought back to the exact words he'd used. That's not what I meant at all. I meant it's hard to get past the nervousness enough to believe that we'll someday be laughing together and anticipating the future. Does that make sense? Jean nodded, trying not to cry. He was covering up the fact that he didn't like her. Of course, he didn't know her, but no one ever really wanted to know her. Her eyes met Aaron's and her friend shook her head. Jean, I need a moment of your time. Jean looked at Dillon. Will you excuse me? Dillon frowned, not wanting her to leave while she didn't believe him. I guess so. Aaron's eyes met Dillon's. Just for a minute. Here, talk to my sister. She urged Megan forward as she grabbed Jean's hand and pulled her back to the room they'd been in before the wedding. He didn't mean that like you took it, Jean. Don't go into your marriage thinking the worst. You have to give him a little bit of trust. Jean felt her eyes fill with tears. It sounded bad. Not to me, it didn't. I understand what he's saying. Tell me you're not nervous right now. Tell me you're not wondering how you're going to go home with someone you hadn't met 30 minutes ago. He's got to be feeling the same way. Jean sighed. I'm being too sensitive. You are. And you can't be. He doesn't know you at all. To him, you're a random woman who agreed to marry him. That's all. Give him a chance. I will. Aaron hugged her tight. I think you made a good decision, Jean, and we both trust Dr. Lachele. You're going to be happy. I know you are. Jean stood for a moment, taking deep breaths. Thanks. I don't know how freaked out I would have gotten if you hadn't been here to keep me calm. I love you, Jean, and do you know what that proves? Jean shook her head. No idea. That you're lovable. Give Dillon a chance to figure that out, would you? I'll try. They walked back out into the sanctuary, and Jean moved to Dillon's side. He looked at her inquiringly. Okay? I'm good. She smiled at him tentatively. We're not having a reception, so what now? She shrugged. Can we have a wedding lunch? Maybe a few friends? She was hungry now, though she hadn't been earlier. Dillon nodded. Sounds like a good idea to me. He looked at the small group of people still lingering, nodding to his oldest friend, Cade. Want to have lunch with us? His friend shrugged. Sure. Ask Nate. He looked down at his bride. Group of 6 good? Jean nodded, taking a deep breath. She'd really only been thinking of spending a few more minutes with Aaron and Megan, but he should have his friends there too if he wanted to. Sounds good to me. They went to a local restaurant known for its exceptional food and lousy service. Jean had never been, but she'd heard of it, and she studied the menu quietly, very aware of Dillon beside her. What's good here? She finally asked. He shrugged. Everything. Just don't take too long to eat it, or they might take your plate away from you. Would they really? Yup. I was talking too much over my grilled shrimp and cheese grits one night, and the waitress just took my plate from me. I told her I wasn't finished yet, but she ignored me. He shrugged. That's terrible. They're known for that kind of service. But the cheese grits and grilled shrimp was good? She found it on her menu and read about it. Having grown up in Wyoming, she'd never had grits before, but she wasn't super picky, and she was feeling adventurous. You had to feel adventurous on the day you married a complete stranger. They were great. Dillon looked at her for a moment as she read her menu. She was a beautiful girl, but for some reason, he knew Dr. Lachele was right. She was fragile, and she needed him to treat her with kid gloves. He'd always dated strong women who went toe-to-toe with him over the smallest thing, so it would be different, but he could handle it. He hoped. That's what I'll have then. She closed the menu and noticed him watching her. What? Just thinking about how beautiful you are, he answered softly. Jean blushed. You don't have to say that. We're already married. I know I don't have to. I want to. Jean looked up and saw Aaron watching them, knowing her friend had heard. At Aaron's slight nod, she did the polite thing. Thank you, she whispered. He took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. Do you live here in Atlanta? She nodded. I live and work downtown. What about you? I grew up in Buckhead, he said, naming an older, affluent neighborhood. I just inherited my great-uncle's house there. He died a few months ago. I'm sorry, she said automatically. Were you close? He shrugged. That's such a hard question to answer. My parents died when I was a baby, and he and a long series of nannies raised me. I can't say if we were close or not, because how do you ever really know what another person was thinking? I loved him, and I respected him. That's all he really asked of me. My parents died when I was 2, she said softly, glad they were already finding some common ground. Really? Who raised you? She shrugged. Anyone and everyone. I bounced from foster home to foster home. No one wanted a little girl who cried herself to sleep for her parents every night. By the time I'd stopped that, I was too old and still no one wanted me. She took a sip of the water in front of her. I wasn't abused. I just wasn't cared for. I'm sorry. He realized that as much as he and his uncle had fought, he'd had it so much better than she had. He was lucky there'd been someone to take him in. No brothers or sisters? She shook her head. Nope. Just me. Her eyes met his, and she noticed for the first time they were an odd shade of gray. She liked them. A lot. You? Any siblings? Nope. No one. No big happy family for our kids, I guess. Kids? Where had that come from? Had his brain already decided this marriage was going to last forever? His heart hurt for a moment. As soon as she'd smiled walking up the aisle, he knew he'd decided that. He was keeping her. For better or for worse. Jean smiled. I guess we'll have to create that big happy family if we want them to have it. I guess we will. By the time lunch was over, she felt a bit more comfortable with him. Not so much that she would relax in his presence any time soon, but at least she wasn't afraid to be alone with him any longer. After the meal, she hugged her friends. The restaurant was close enough to the hotel, they could easily walk back. It was less than a block, and they could take a cab to the airport from there. I'm going to miss you both so much. Aaron smiled. But you won't be alone now. Call me Monday evening, and we'll talk. I want to make sure he didn't kill you in your sleep. You're just saying that because your mother said it to you. Every woman needs someone to say that to her when she marries a total stranger. Jean laughed. Like a normal woman would do such a thing. She turned and smiled at Megan. Take care of you and baby. I will. I'll be in touch. Megan squeezed her tightly in a hug. You're my friend too, you know. I know. Jean turned to look at Dillon. My stuff is in my car. At the church? He asked, brow furrowed. He should have known to get it before they left, but she also should have said something. His little mouse of a wife was going to cause a lot of frustration over the next few months. Yeah. I didn't think of grabbing it then. Maybe I should just follow you two. Where are we going anyway? Jean felt a moment of panic as she realized that she had no idea where she'd be spending the night. We'll go back to my place. And you can follow me, or I can drive you to the church to pick up your car tomorrow or Monday. Did you take some time off work? If she had, he would. If she hadn't, he wouldn't. He had an easy time changing his schedule at the drop of a hat. She shook her head. I got Friday off, but I can't take any more time. It's tax season, and we're always swamped at this time of year. I had no idea stockbrokers were affected by tax season. Interesting. Well, people call for tax records, so that's why we're busy. They want to reorder tax forms, discuss capital gains, that sort of thing. All kinds of boring stuff that would make you fall asleep if I went into detail. She watched her friends walk away toward the hotel as she followed Dillon to his car. It was a sensible car, not the type she'd expect from a man who had grown up in Buckhead. He drove toward the church, very aware of her beside him. He hadn't even thought about whether he'd want to consummate the marriage until that moment, but he knew he did. She was beautiful, and he was more than a little attracted to her. Would she be willing? She seemed so fearful of everything, he was afraid to broach the topic at all. Do we need to go by your place for anything? She shook her head. Nope. I have what I need in my car. I'll need to go back after work on Monday, but that shouldn't be too hard to do without inconveniencing you. You're not an inconvenience to me, he said, looking at her as they stopped at a traffic light. She sighed. I shouldn't have said it that way. What I mean is I can stop when you're not with me, so you don't have to waste your time. Are you planning on moving everything to my place? There was no way he was going to move. The house may be too big for them, but it was his family home. He wanted his children to grow up there. Children? He was thinking about children again. Marriage was getting to him, and he'd only been married a couple of hours. Yes, but that can wait until next weekend, right? My lease isn't up until the end of the month, so we have plenty of time to make it happen. Sounds good to me. Do you work on the weekends? She sighed heavily. Not usually, but I sometimes have to during tax season. I took Friday off, so I might have to pick up a day next weekend. I hope not, though. She looked at him. How about you? He shrugged. I work as little or as much as I want to. I love what I do, and that's why I do it. For a while I had a corporate job for my great-uncle's firm, but I hated it so much. My dad was a carpenter. He loved to work with his hands. I'd say he taught me, but I have no memories of him. It just seems to be in my blood. What did your uncle do? He was the CEO of a huge company. He named a firm that had her eyes going wide. Really? I remember when he died. You don't have the same last name. He shook his head. No, my mom was his niece. I have my dad's name. We talked once about him formally adopting me, but neither of us cared enough to make it happen. Dillon had been raised mostly by nannies, and he'd seen his uncle for meals a few times a week. Truly, the man had been very distant. His friends had thought he had it made, not having to really answer to a parental figure. He wished he could explain to them just how wrong they'd been. Chapter 4. Dillon moved Jean's suitcase to his car and drove to the only home he'd ever known. He'd gone away for college, but other than that, he'd lived in this same house his entire life. He parked his car in the garage, trying not to pay attention to her shocked gasp when she saw the house. He knew, though. He'd grown up in a life of wealth and privilege, while she'd been shuffled from one foster home to another. They were both orphans, yet their circumstances couldn't have been more different. I'll carry your things up, he offered as he got out of the car. She nodded, biting her lip. She hoped his house wasn't full of servants, but that's exactly what she expected of a house this size. Do you live alone? He nodded. I do. There's a woman who comes in during the week to clean, and she usually leaves a meal for me. I can cancel that if you want, but then you're going to have to feed me, because I can burn water. Aaron got a chocolatier. Huh? Sorry. My friend Aaron was matched to a chocolatier. He even invented a candy for her and named it after her. She shrugged. just thinking about the different matches made by the infamous Dr. Lachele. How well do you know that woman? Is she a bit balmy? She giggled. Balmy? He shrugged. I have some odd language habits. It comes from living with someone so much older my entire life. I like it. I've always liked words like that. I read a lot of historical romance, and they use antiquated words all the time. Romance? Why don't you strike me as the type to like romance? She laughed. Probably because I'm a stockbroker. We're known for being boring and serious. Aaron got me hooked on them in college. You two seem really close. He opened the door and guided her inside, seeing the house with fresh eyes. It was huge, and everything had been professionally decorated. It was a good house for entertaining guests. There was even a ballroom that his mother had once come out in. It's beautiful, she said softly, feeling more than a little overwhelmed by the house. It's home. He led her up the stairs. I wasn't sure what to expect, so I cleaned out half of my drawers and my closet, but I also had a guest bedroom prepared. She bit her lip, standing in the hallway at the top of the stairs. She took a deep breath, trying to figure out exactly how to respond. Do you have a preference? He smiled. I'm a man. I want you in my bed every night for the rest of our lives. I'm not going to force you into anything you're not ready for, though. I'm a nervous wreck at the mere thought, she said, closing her eyes for a moment. Then we'll wait. He shrugged. It won't kill me. Just maim me a little. I'll do better getting it over with, though. Less time to worry about it is good for me. He sighed. I don't know how I feel about being in the same category as bad medicine, but if you're offering, I'm accepting. He pushed open a door at the end of the hall. This is the master bedroom. She stepped into the huge room, her eyes wide. There was a balcony right in front of her, and she walked over and opened the door, stepping out to look over the city. She was glad she'd thought to change from her wedding dress before they had gone out to eat. She now wore a casual spring dress in a mint green. Leaning on the railing, she looked out over the huge garden. You must have loved playing there when you were a little boy. He stepped out beside her, his eyes on her and not on the view. I did. I often hid and made my nanny try and find me. There was a large pool with a small house beside it. I use the pool house as a guest house now. Have you ever stayed there? After I graduated from college, I lived there. Right up until my uncle got sick about a year ago. How'd he die? Jean looked up at him curiously. Cancer. He was always a smoker, and lung cancer finally got him. He never smoked in the house, because he'd read too much about secondhand smoke, but he'd step outside every night after supper. I always knew he was smoking. Dillon turned to her. Do you know he never stopped? He smoked until the day he died. Said it was too late to change when he was already half dead. I found him in his bed one morning. He died in his sleep. She put her hand over his on the railing, offering what little comfort she could. Did you know he was close? Yeah. We'd called in hospice a couple of weeks before, so there was no doubt he was on his way out. His eyes were distant as he stared out over the garden. I miss his cantankerous ways. Cantankerous? He was always griping about something. His generation did everything better. That sort of thing. You know the type. I do. I had a foster father who was that way. The last one, actually. Dillon turned to her. How long were you with him? I moved in with them when I was 15 and stayed until I graduated from high school. His wife was my favorite. She was a grandmotherly type. Very kind. Are you still in touch with them? She nodded. I send them a Christmas card every year. I called and told them I was getting married, but I knew they wouldn't be able to come. It's too far for a weekend. I'd like to meet them one day. I'm sure you will. They're nice people, and they seem to truly care about me. She stepped closer to him, even as she worried he'd reject her. I'm really nervous about being alone with a man I've only known for a few hours, and I'm even more nervous knowing we're going to be making love tonight. I just felt like you should know that. Dillon smiled, looking down at her. I appreciate that information. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Do you want the tour of the house? She shook her head. Not right now. Why don't I put my things away, and we can, I don't know what we can do. What do you do in the evenings? I read or watch television. I love sports. If you weren't here, I'd probably be watching the Braves today. Jean shrugged. You watch the Braves, and I'll read a book. Problem solved. He looked at her for a moment. Seriously? You wouldn't care if I watched baseball on our wedding night? If you don't care if I lose myself in a romance novel, I won't care if you watch baseball. Sounds like a fair deal to me. Very. He stroked her cheek with the back of one finger. I think you're going to be the very best of wives. Because I'm willing to let you watch sports. It gives me a chance to do what I want. I don't expect you to be all attentive to me, because you just met me. It's not like we're a love match. Not yet, anyway. He leaned down and brushed his lips softly against hers. I've been wanting to do that since the first time I kissed you. Really? Jean was surprised. She'd never had a boyfriend. She was so shy and withdrawn. No man had ever attempted to kiss her or even really flirted with her. Or if they had, she hadn't noticed. It was hard for her to think of herself as desirable. Why does that surprise you so much? She shrugged, shivering as his hand stroked over her shoulders. There was something about his touch that made her knees turn to jello. I've never really dated. Why not? He was shocked. She was too pretty to have never been asked out. I never had the courage. I know it's silly. When I was in school, I spent all my time studying. Then after I graduated, I spent all my time working. I've met few people I didn't work with here in Atlanta. How long have you lived here? She shrugged. Not long. A few years. He shook his head in disbelief. You have work friends, though, right? I have people I talk to at work. Does that mean they're work friends? And you go out and get dinner after work on occasion? Go out and dance? I don't think stockbrokers go out. I've worked 60 hours per week since I moved here. Every minute I'm not at work, I'm doing laundry and studying the market, trying to make sure I have a good understanding of my job. It's been my whole life. And you're going to keep doing that now that we're married? It's part of the job. I won't be seen as serious if I stop. He sighed. I don't want my wife working that much. What happens if you're not seen as serious? I'm passed over for promotions. Please tell me I have to stop working so much. I don't know what I'll do with my time, but tell me you want me to spend some of it with you. Would that break your heart? I can't imagine never seeing my wife. What about when we have children? Do you even want children? Until a few hours before, he hadn't been certain he wanted them, but now he knew he did. He'd thought about them a lot since he'd met her. It wouldn't break my heart. I do want children. That's why I wanted to get married. Maybe not this month, or even this year, but within 5 years for sure. I can't imagine anything more fulfilling than raising children. Then you're willing to cut down on your hours at work? You mean now? Or when children come? I guess when children come. He was disappointed that she didn't want to spend more time with him, but maybe that would change as they got to know one another better. He hoped so. When children come, I will definitely slow down. She was sad that he hadn't wanted her to slow down now, but he didn't know her well enough to care about what she did with her time. Why did you decide to contact Dr. Lachele? What made you want to marry? He frowned. I'd really rather not talk about that at the moment, if you don't mind. He still felt like Uncle Larry had betrayed him. All right. Feeling like the conversation was over, she turned toward the door to go back inside. I'm going to unpack my things and grab my Kindle. Then you can take me to wherever you're going to watch television, and I'll read. Sounds good. I'll wait here for you. He leaned against the balcony, looking out over the pool. In another month, it would be warm enough to swim there. He wondered if she enjoyed swimming. There were so many things he needed to learn about her yet, and he wasn't sure how quickly that was going to happen. She was opening up more than he'd expected, considering how shy she'd seemed, but still he felt like she was hiding something. Jean felt overwhelming sadness wash over her as she put her things away. Not only did he not want her to stop working so much, he wouldn't tell her why he'd wanted to get married in the first place. She was sure it wasn't a good idea to start a marriage with secrets, but how could she get him to tell her what he was thinking? When she finished, she opened the sliding glass door leading out onto the balcony. I'm finished. He stepped back inside and locked the door behind him. There are 3 living rooms, but I prefer to watch television in the game room. Uncle Larry thought I needed a place to hang out with my friends, so he had this game room built. He left the bedroom and led her downstairs and toward the back of the house. He put it as far from his study as he could, because he didn't want to hear the noise we made, but he wanted me to be able to bring friends over and have something to do. He opened the door to a teenage boy's dream room. I loved it here. My friends would come over, and we'd play video games or foosball. He walked to the far side of the room, where there was a lavish television viewing area. We'd watch movies here. He sat down on a couch with reclining seats on both ends, putting his feet up. Jean frowned for a moment, wondering if she should be forward and sit in the middle, or if he'd prefer she sat down on the other end from him. Finally, she decided it would be best just to ask. She didn't want there to be misunderstandings between them. Would you rather I sat in the middle or at the other end? He looked up at her with surprise. Where would you rather sit? She bit her lip. She wanted to sit close to him, but she didn't think it was smart for her to just blurt that out. I'd rather sit in the middle. He smiled, taking her hand and pulling her down beside him. That's what I'd rather too. Just do what you want to do. There's no reason to be nervous around me. Jean shook her head. If you think it's that simple, you don't know me at all. I think that's part of our problem. We don't know each other at all. But we're going to get there. And I'm going to enjoy every minute of the experience. He slid his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer against him. In a few days, you're going to feel like you've known me forever. She sighed. If only it were that easy. She wished it was, but she knew herself. It would be a while before she felt like she could even speak openly with him without being shy. Do you have plans for tomorrow? He shook his head. Not really. I thought we'd play things by ear. I love to walk on Sundays, so if you're up for that, it would be nice. Or we can move some of your things over from your place. I don't have a truck. How will we move things? I'll call some friends. Have you started packing? She nodded. I already have everything in boxes and ready to move. I've moved before, but I've never really had furniture or anything. It was more a few boxes of stuff. Now I have a whole household. We'll get you moved tomorrow afternoon if you want. I have no idea what we're going to do with my furniture. He frowned. They certainly wouldn't need it. Are you especially attached to anything? Not at all. I just bought stuff as I could. What he had was so much nicer. There would be no need for any of it at all. Then we'll call a charity and have them take it away. There are a couple of women's shelters in town. They're always needing stuff for women as they're getting back on their feet. I'll make a call on Monday and they can have whatever you don't want. That's not a bad idea, but I can't be there during the day to wait for someone to come get it. Jean hated that she had no flexibility with her schedule at all. Don't worry about that. My life is very flexible. I'll wait for them. Dillon pressed a kiss to her forehead. There are solutions for everything. He picked up the remote and turned the TV on, immediately getting engrossed in the game. Jean looked down at her Kindle, reading the book Aaron had recommended. It was nice to have a weekend completely free from work. Maybe she could do it again sometime. Chapter 5. Jean slipped out of bed before Dillon woke the next morning, took a quick shower, and went downstairs to cook. She couldn't help but blush as she thought about their activities of the previous night. She hadn't expected him to be so kind and loving. She shook her head, mixing up the batter for pancakes. There was never anyone for her to cook for, so she tended to go for microwave meals, and it was nice to know there was someone who would eat what she made. She was just putting pancakes and bacon onto 2 plates, when she felt arms coming around her from behind. "Good morning, beautiful." Jean turned in his arms, burying her face against his neck. She didn't want him to see her blushing, but she knew that's all she'd be able to do for 6 months or so, while she got used to the intimate side of their relationship. "Morning." Dillon cupped her face in his hands, tilting it up for a kiss. "I was hoping you'd be beside me when I woke up. I thought you might want breakfast." She couldn't seem to look above his chin, but she hoped he wouldn't notice. How did people ever talk to each other after making love? "Breakfast sounds good. I called my friend Cade, and he's going to help us move you today. He has a truck, and he'll bring a couple of his teammates. We'll get it done in no time." Her eyes met his finally. "Teammates? Cade's a professional football player. You didn't recognize him?" She shook her head. "I don't even recognize famous actors. Well, except the people on Lazy Love, and I only watch that every week, because Aaron will spoil it for me if I don't. She has to talk about it the next day no matter what." "You guys talk a lot? Even though you're in different states?" "She's my best friend. The fact that we rarely see each other without Skype has nothing to do with anything. We make time for each other." She turned from him and picked up both plates, carrying them to the table. "I didn't know if you were a coffee drinker." He shook his head. "I'm not. Are you?" "Only on days I work. I need the caffeine pumping through my system to exist in that world." "I think you should quit your job," he said abruptly. "I can feel how much you hate it, and how draining it is." "But what would I do?" she asked, her brows drawn together. "It's not like I can just sit around and be idle." "Why not open that bookstore you talked about?" She frowned. "I probably have enough money saved to do that, but I wouldn't be able to contribute to our household income at all." He shrugged. "You've seen my house. We don't need your income. Maybe someday. I would need to have plans to open the store before I could quit my job. I really can't see myself not working at all. If that's what you want." He poured syrup on his pancakes and took a bite. "The guys are going to meet us here around 10. Is that all right with you?" She glanced at the clock on the wall, seeing it was just after 8. "That sounds good. It'll give me time to have breakfast and get the kitchen cleaned up after. The pancakes are really good. I figured I'd take you out for breakfast. I wasn't expecting you to cook for me. I really do enjoy cooking, unless I'm just cooking for myself. It's nice to have someone to feed." "Are you going to spoil me so rotten no one will be able to stand me?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. Jean laughed softly. "I'm sure that won't happen. Maybe on the weekends, you'll get a good breakfast." I won't even have time to cook supper during the week. My housekeeper will take care of dinners. That's no big deal. Dillon reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. I hope you can find a way to at least cut back on your hours. I think we need time together to get to know each other. I was kind of hoping we could take off for a week somewhere, but if you're working, that just isn't going to happen. I'm sorry. She looked down at her plate. I'm the most reliable person at work. They would have a difficult time if I decided to just take some time off with no notice. I had a hard enough time getting Friday off. Well, I can't ask you to do more than you can do. He frowned as he took a bite of his bacon. The excitement of having his new wife make breakfast for him was wearing off quickly. So what time will you go into work tomorrow, and what time will you get off? I'll go in around 6. I'll be home around 8 or 9. That long? He shook his head. It was what he thought he wanted when he started looking for a wife. One who would be out of sight and easy to deal with. He found himself resenting her job more by the minute. As soon as tax season is over, I should be able to cut down to 8-hour days again, but I might still have to work 12. Oh, yippee skippy. He shook his head. What if I want to take off for the coast tomorrow and spend a couple of days on the beach? Then I guess you'll have to go without me. Jean didn't know where the words came from. She'd never stood up to anyone, but his attitude about her work was really getting on her nerves. I might have to. He carried his plate to the sink. Just leave the dishes for the housekeeper tomorrow, unless you can't bear to only work 6 hours on your day off instead of 15. Jean watched him leave, tears stinging her eyes. It was their first fight, and she didn't like it. She honestly couldn't remember ever fighting with anyone other than Aaron a couple of times when they were first roommates. What was it about having a marriage certificate that made people fight? Asterisk. By 6 that evening, everything in Jean's apartment had been moved, except the furniture, which a local charity would pick up the next day. Dillon had offered to wait for the charity people to come so she wouldn't have to miss work. He'd even managed to say it without a great deal of sarcasm filling his voice. She smiled at Cade shyly, thanking him for his help. Shouldn't we buy you pizza or something? Cade shook his head. Nope. You have a 2-day honeymoon. I'm not going to infringe on that. He shook hands with Dillon. Be happy. Dillon nodded. Thanks for all your help, and thanks for bringing along big friends. Much appreciated. I'd say any time, but that would be a lie. How about any time you marry this sweet little lady? I will be here to help her move into your home. Sounds like all I could ever ask for. Dillon couldn't help but grin. After she'd left, Dillon turned to Jean, taking her hand and drawing her into one of the formal living rooms his uncle had always entertained in. He sat down on the couch and pulled her down into his lap. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have been so rude with you this morning. You're doing what any responsible employee would do, and I was being snotty about it. She sighed, sinking into him. I know I work too much, and I'm going to try to cut back. Does that help any? He nodded. It does. Try to do it soon, will you? I'll try to cut down to 8-hour days after the 15th. Would that work? That would be wonderful. He pulled her close for a kiss. I like my new wife, and I want to spend time with her. She rested her cheek against his shoulder. I like you too. Asterisk. True to her word, Jean had a meeting with her boss as soon as April 15th had passed, letting him know that she would be cutting back to 8 hours per day. I know that you expect more from me, but I'm a newlywed now, and I can't keep working those hours. Her boss, an older gentleman, who had always made it clear he didn't think women belonged in the fast-paced world of finance, nodded. Of course. I'm surprised you'll keep working at all. Women really should be home once they're married. Jean smiled sweetly, not commenting on that. I do plan to keep up my normal work schedule, but my husband has a right to see me. As she left his office, she shook her head, needing to get the image of his condescending face out of her head. She walked to her cubicle and straightened up for the day. It was only 6, but she was going home to her husband. Starting tomorrow, she would leave at 4, like most of her coworkers. She knew she'd just cut herself out of any chance of promotion, but how much did that matter? She headed out to her car, leaving her work behind. She wasn't going to take work home anymore either. She felt like she'd barely seen Dillon since they'd married, and that wasn't the way to have a successful marriage. She knew, because she'd been reading books on how to make your marriage a success since Dr. Lachele had told her she'd been matched. Now was the time to put everything she'd learned into action. When she got home, she surprised Dillon, who was sitting at the table having a lonely supper. "Hi." His head jerked up in surprise. He must not have heard her come in. "What are you doing home so early?" He got to his feet and walked to her, wrapping his arms around her. "You're not sick, are you?" She laughed softly. "It's April 16th. I'm down to 8-hour days like I promised. I don't have to leave for work until 7, and I'll be home by about 5 every night from now on." "You really did it?" "I said I would. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." Jean pulled his head down for a kiss. After 2 weeks of marriage, she was a lot less shy about being intimate than she'd been the first couple of days. "What did Mrs. Stevens make for supper?" "I'm hungry." He was surprised. From what he'd seen, she was rarely hungry and ate very little. "I don't know." He shrugged. "I just eat whatever she puts in front of me." Jean laughed. "Then I will eat mystery food with you." She went to the kitchen and got herself a plate, utensils, and a glass of water, before sitting down beside him. After eating a forkful of the mystery food, she frowned at him. "That's quiche." "Quiche? No wonder I didn't know the name. Men aren't supposed to eat quiche." She shook her head at him. "Do you like it?" "It's my favorite of all the mystery meals I eat." She smiled and took another bite. "Will they take your man card from you? Or will you be able to keep it because you didn't know what it was?" "I'm hiding it. No one will get my man card. Ever." It was weird driving home when it was still light out. "I'm not sure I'll be able to get used to that." "And you'll be home even earlier tomorrow, right?" "I don't know if I can handle my wife being around so much. Where will I hide my mistress?" Her eyes grew wide. "Mistress?" "I'm kidding. If I had a mistress, I'd have married her instead of a stranger." She eyed him curiously. "Are you ready to talk about why you did marry me?" She'd had so many thoughts about why he could have done it bounce around in her brain, and she couldn't help but wonder if one of them was right. She knew it wasn't the one where he'd been forced to marry by an alien in a spacecraft, but could it be the one where he was afraid of an ex-girlfriend who was trying to trick him into marriage? He took a deep breath, knowing he had to talk to her about it now. The longer he hid the truth from her, the harder it would be. "As part of my Uncle Larry's will, he said that I had to be married within 3 months. His lawyer was at the wedding, and he'll be checking up on us every month for the first year." Jean shrugged. "Is that all? I was sure you'd been abducted by aliens, and the only way you could break their hold over you is if you married and fell in love with an Earth woman who would then be required to have alien babies in your stead." Dillon choked on his quiche. "Why are you a stockbroker instead of a science fiction writer?" "I needed a guaranteed paycheck. I didn't want to spend my life as a starving artist, wandering the streets of Soho looking for a handout." "Soho?" he asked. It was the first artsy place that came to mind. "If I was going to be a writer, I'd do what Thoreau did instead. I'd head to a pond or lake in the middle of nowhere and ignore everyone and everything. Blissful solitude. You'd take me though, right? Because you have realized that you can't live without me." She chewed her bite of the ham and cheese quiche slowly as she thought about her answer. I guess I would. I would need someone to carry my suitcase after all. He shook his head, laughing at her. She had changed a lot as she'd slowly emerged from her shell. He liked her more every day,